Today we're going to have a look at making hardwood cuttings, and this is a much easier exercise than you might realize, and it's a very cheap way of multiplying up your plants without using any expensive heat in the mist frame. And we're going to look at a number of different subjects, all of which are really quite tough and easy to grow plants. A lot of them are hedging plants, and it's a great way of bulking up this sort of thing with a minimum of fuss and bother. Hardwood cuttings can be much larger cuttings than ordinary cuttings you might put in a mist bench, and it's ideal for growing large quantities of hedging plants or things that you want in bulk. So basically what we're doing is preparing a nice piece of this year's growth, and we're cutting it off nicely at the top, and we're cutting it off nicely at the bottom, and we're scarring the bottom of the stem where we hope the roots will appear from. And we'll pause for a moment while Asher just bulks up a decent quantity of some of these. So each piece of stem will actually make several hardwood cuttings. And Ash has now got to the tip of the stem, and some of those leaves are still green, so she's not going to cut them all off. She's just going to trim them in half as you would if you were putting cuttings in a mist bench, but of course we're going to be putting these outside. So we've got a little collection now of hardwood cuttings. They're slightly variable in size and length and thickness, but that doesn't really matter. We're dealing here with a very quick growing willow, and it's exactly the sort of plant which we can bulk up quickly. We're just going to give the hardwood cuttings a little dose of hormone rooting powder, and then, as you'll see in a moment, we'll be going on to put them into the ground outside, or we could simply insert them into a pot as we're doing here. They'll grow just as well inside in the greenhouse as hardwood cuttings in a pot as they would out in a cold frame outside. Now there's room for probably another 8 or 10 cuttings in that same pot, and you shouldn't be worried about planting your hardwood cuttings extremely thickly, because once they root and root properly by probably the early part of next summer, and then you see the cuttings come into growth, that's the moment when actually you can shake them out, disentangle the roots and throw away any dead ones, and simply pot on into a larger pot, or even plant them straight into the ground if they've rooted as vigorously as we might hope. So we're not going to fill up all of that little pot at this moment, but we'll move on to just trying experimenting with hardwood cuttings in one or two other types of species for which hardwood cuttings are suitable. So let's select now a piece of fuchsia. This is a tough, hardy fuchsia. It's a species. It's a fuchsia that's still in full leaf today, but there's no point wasting expensive heat trying to grow that sort of fuchsia if it'll grow perfectly well with very little heat and very little encouragement as a hardwood cutting. And again, we can make use of really quite a lot of the stem. We're not interested in the little small side shoots which we might have made cuttings for in the mist frame. We're just looking to get a good piece of stem and to scar the bottom of it where the hormone rooting powder will be applied and where we hope the roots will come. Again, there's no need to waste very much. You can make several hardwood cuttings out of the one stem, and we won't bore you by making a very large quantity of them, but you get the general idea that this is simple and straightforward, and that they too can be very straightforwardly inserted into a small pot or into the ground after we've dipped them in the rooting powder. Some people might even, instead of putting them in individually, might bundle them up into 3s and 5s and plant them like that together. That's another perfectly acceptable way of doing it. So while we've been waiting, Ash has made some nice hardwood cuttings of a Deutzia. And again, you can see that we've selected a piece of this year, a vigorous piece of this year's new growth. We haven't bothered with a heel where it was attached to the main plant. You don't really need that for hardwood cuttings, but we have scarred the stems. They really don't look much, but if they take as we expect, those side shoots will burst into leaf probably late in the spring, early in the summer, and then we'll know the plants have rooted. But we come on now to look at a slightly more complicated subject, which is a Buddleja. And a lot of our Buddlejas are still in full leaf, although it's, you know, late November. But you can see here we've got a hard woody stem, and that is really the secret of hardwood cuttings. As the name implies, there's a nice hardened off woody stem. And that woody stem is what we need. We're going to remove the leaves, which are of no use to us, but we'll leave those, probably leave some of those little side shoots, or just nip out the leading shoot in them, and then we'll scar away the hardwood cutting just as we have before. Here we probably won't bother with the tips of the shoots because the new growth is still a bit floppy there and it's not hardened off and woody, and so it's probably not likely to root properly as a hardwood cutting. But it's a fairly quick procedure and a fairly straightforward one. One stops to think what plants in the garden are suitable for hardwood cuttings, and you can always experiment. It's cost nothing if you fail with something. Generally, a lot of evergreens, a lot of common evergreens, hollies, buxus, lonicera, all those things grow very simply from hardwood cuttings. But when you get to something like the Berberis, which Asher is going to go to next, obviously you've got a few rather nasty prickles in the way. And with Berberis, it's probably as well to get a good heel. So as you'll see, Asher is breaking the new growth away from the old stem to give a proper heel. And she will now prune off to that heel, and that heel is where we'll scar the stem. But unlike some of the other hardwood cuttings, Berberis are going to be a bit more difficult. They'll probably take longer to root, and where you've got more complicated things to do, it's just as well to have a proper heel from where the new growth joined the old wood, and that should give you a much better chance of making a decent cutting. But again, you need to probably mind your fingers, and it might be as well if Ash had been wearing gloves there, although she of course wasn't. We could go on and make many more of these hardwood cuttings, and probably in a couple of hours you could make 200 or 300 of different sorts of things. But here we're simply showing you the art of the possible, and we'll just cut there while we get these few inserted in their pots. So we've now got a couple of potfuls of a Berberis and a Buddleja, and as I say, these could be stood outside, they could be left in the greenhouse, and as long as you keep them watered, they should root away fine. But in the real world, hardwood cuttings should be actually kept outside, and and grown outside, preferably in a cold frame or in a pot or in trays. But let's go and have a look at hardwood cuttings in the cold frame. So here is our hardwood cutting frame, and we have coverings to put over it, basically to keep birds, mice and rats from digging around in this nice upraised bed. We don't need any other protection at all. And you're looking at a few hardwood cuttings which were taken this time last year, which were rather slow to root, and which Asher has left in place to be dug up again next spring. And you can see some nice hollies there that were very slow to root, which is why they're still here, and a few conifers some of which have rooted reasonably well, and some of which only one or two have rooted from, and a nice rubus species which I think probably took quite a while to root and has now suckered up and grown in multiple places. So you've actually got what started off as a relatively few hardwood cuttings has now turned into quite a nice little batch of plants. And if we look just down this end, we see some other hardwood cuttings that Asher has already put in, and we can see that she's trying some conifers, some hollies, some lomatia, and a few other conifers there, some quite rare things which we're trying. They may or may not work, but the whole point is that we don't need to take much time or trouble looking after them. They'll look after themselves here. If they don't root, they get thrown away. If they do root, we've got a relatively cheap plant, grown in quantity, and as I say, it's the commoner things which most people grow as hardwood cuttings. So Ash is now going to just put a few of those we've made earlier straight into the ground in a row, and we use a bamboo cane just to differentiate row on row, so that we can get a proper label at the end of the row and avoid any confusion and muddle. And we need to firm in these hardwood cuttings properly, and then we can start another row. It's astonishing how many hardwood cuttings you can get into a very small space. Obviously when they start to root and grow, you can soon be overrun, but then you need to lift out the ones that have rooted and move them on. So we aren't going to fill the whole row here, because that would be really quite boring and tedious, but there's a lot of space to fill there, and it's a cheap and efficient way of doing your own propagation of plants which you don't want to go and buy at great expense, but which you can produce yourself in 18 months or so, cheaply and simply, and if they don't root, you haven't lost much.